By the summer of 1944, long before the German army collapsed in the snow of the Ardennes or the ruins of Berlin, a quieter collapse had already begun, one far more decisive than any tank duel or infantry assault. It began in the war rooms of the Wehrmacht, where generals who had once preached blitzkrieg now whispered the truth they dared not say aloud in public. Germany was no longer fighting the American army. It was fighting American logistics, and that was a war it could not win. Across intercepted reports, intelligence summaries, and POW interrogations, a single realization reappeared again and again. The United States possessed a level of supply, of fuel, ammunition, transport, and industrial output so immense that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome it. Hitler still believed the war would be decided by tanks and offensives, but the men responsible for actually fighting the Allies saw it differently. They saw an enemy who could bring more fuel to a single division in 1 week than Germany could deliver to an entire panzer army in a month. They saw an opponent who replaced lost trucks and tanks faster than the Wehrmacht could repair its own. They saw formations that never stalled for lack of fuel, never rationed artillery shells, never waited for ammunition convoys that never came. And they understood that this imbalance, this ocean of supply behind every American soldier, was the true engine of Allied victory. The numbers alone were staggering. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil, more than 50 times Germany's output of roughly 33 million barrels, most of it synthetic fuel manufactured from coal in plants vulnerable to Allied bombing. German panzer divisions were starved from the moment they rolled off the assembly line. American armored divisions swam in gasoline. A single U.S. armored division consumed up to 100,000 gallons of fuel per day during offensive operations. The United States provided it without hesitation or strain. Germany could barely provide that much fuel to an entire corps. Generals like Guderian, Rundstedt, and Model understood the implications. They watched as their tanks stood idle, not for lack of courage or mechanical failure, but for lack of the fluid that made them move. They watched infantry divisions reduced to marching because trucks could not be fueled. And they watched the Allies advance not because their tactics were always superior, but because they possessed the one advantage no army in history had ever held at such scale: an industrial base untouched by war, pumping out oil, steel, ammunition, trucks, and aircraft at volumes no Axis nation could approach. German staff officers studying American supply dumps were astonished. Piles of jerry cans, ammunition pallets, spare tires, MRE crates, radio batteries, lubricants, and engineering gear stretched across French fields in quantities they had never imagined. One German colonel, captured after the breakout from Normandy, stared at the sheer abundance and muttered, "This is not an army, this is a continent marching." And he was not wrong. The U.S. Army in Europe was the military expression of the world's largest economy, a logistics machine backed by pipelines, refineries, factories, railroads, and shipyards spanning 3,000 miles of American soil. The scale of American industry meant that the U.S. Army could fight continuously with no operational pauses forced by supply shortages. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, lived in a constant cycle of rationing, improvisation, and strategic hesitation. German divisions in Normandy often fired artillery at half their authorized rate because shells were scarce. American divisions, supplied by Liberty ships and DUKWs streaming ashore after D-Day, fired tens of thousands of rounds per day. At Saint-Lô, a single U.S. artillery battalion fired more shells in one afternoon than many German divisions received in a full week. Even in the face of Allied bombing, German industry simply could not sustain the rates of fire demanded by modern war. Every tank they lost was irreplaceable, every truck was precious, every gallon of fuel was a gamble. Meanwhile, the Americans operated under the opposite principle: use everything, replace everything, and never fight at half strength. Their soldiers were carried by an endless fleet of GMC CCKW trucks and jeeps. Their tanks were supported by repair crews with unlimited spare parts. Their pilots flew knowing new aircraft awaited them if theirs was damaged. Their commanders planned battles confident that ammunition would never run out. German commanders planned battles confident that ammunition would run out. By late 1944, this imbalance had grown so severe that many German officers privately admitted the war could not be won, not because the Americans were better fighters, but because they were better supplied. Rundstedt said it outright. Our enemy has the resources of a continent. We have the resources of a nation surrounded and bombed. For the Wehrmacht, the turning point was not a battlefield, but a mathematical truth. An American army that never stopped receiving fuel, food, weapons, and reinforcements could not be stopped by an army that lived on shortages. Germany could win battles. It could not win the war of tonnage. And so, in the shadows of their collapsing front lines, German commanders began to fear not the Sherman, nor the P-47, nor the Allied infantrymen, but the vast, inexhaustible logistics machine that made the American army unstoppable.
Long before American tanks reached the Siegfried Line or Patton's columns swept across France, the true defeat of the Wehrmacht was already sealed in places Germans would never see. The oil fields of Texas and California, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the assembly lines of Detroit, and the refineries of Baton Rouge. It was there, thousands of miles from the front, that a level of industrial power emerged so overwhelming that German planners simply could not comprehend it. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, while German industry, hammered by Allied bombing, deprived of aluminum, and starved of labor, produced barely a quarter of that number. And even those German aircraft often sat unused for want of trained pilots or aviation fuel. The United States had no such constraints. It manufactured more aircraft than it had pilots to fly them, more tanks than divisions required, more artillery shells than any army in history had ever fired. Logistics shaped every battlefield outcome, and by 1944, the U.S. had constructed the greatest logistical infrastructure the world had ever seen. For German commanders, the most devastating statistic was not aircraft production, nor tank production. It was oil. In the summer of 1944, the U.S. produced approximately 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil, while Germany's production, crippled by bombing and dependent on complex synthetic fuel processes, barely reached 33 million barrels. Even before the collapse of Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, the Wehrmacht was starving for fuel. Panzer divisions operated at a fraction of their intended strength. Luftwaffe training hours dropped to catastrophic lows. Reconnaissance flights were cancelled not because of enemy action, but because there was no aviation gasoline left to waste. The Americans, by contrast, swam in fuel. The U.S. Army could operate entire armored corps without hesitation, sending Sherman tanks racing across France at speeds no German commander believed possible. Patton's Third Army consumed more fuel in a single week of offensive operations than Germany could deliver to the entire Western Front in the same period. And thanks to the U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine, the logistical pipeline from America to Europe never stopped flowing. Liberty ships, Victory ships, and tanker convoys poured across the Atlantic faster than German submarines could sink them. But the real triumph was not simply in production, but in distribution. American logistics was designed around a principle the Germans had no ability to mimic: redundancy everywhere. If a truck broke down, another replaced it. If a trainload of ammunition was delayed, 3 more were already en route. Every American soldier received rations, clothing, and ammunition at levels German soldiers considered luxurious. Even the quality of American food shocked captured Wehrmacht troops. Where German units often lived on watery soup and black bread, American infantry ate meat, vegetables, fruit, and chocolate. Well-fed soldiers fought better, marched farther, and endured longer. German morale, already strained by shortages, cracked further with every encounter. American industry also achieved something Germany could not: modular logistics. Tanks used standardized parts, trucks used universal tires and engines. Even radios followed interchangeable patterns. This meant American repair crews could rebuild equipment in the field at astonishing speed. A Sherman tank knocked out by minor damage might return to service within hours. A German Panther with a broken track or transmission often had to be abandoned. The ratio grew so lopsided that in Normandy, American armored divisions sometimes recovered and repaired more tanks per week than German units received as replacements in an entire month. The United States did not just produce weapons, it produced the capacity to sustain war indefinitely. That capacity manifested most dramatically in ammunition. In 1944, U.S. factories produced nearly 7 million tons of munitions. German artillery units rationed shells, firing only when absolutely necessary. American units fired when they wanted, as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted. In Operation Cobra, some U.S. artillery battalions fired so many rounds that barrels had to be replaced mid-battle. German commanders watching the bombardment described it as a weight of metal impossible to imagine. Perhaps the greatest psychological blow came from the realization that American production did not slow down even during the heaviest battles. As German industry collapsed under Allied bombing, American production soared. While factories in Hamburg, Essen, and Schweinfurt lay in ruins, American production lines added shifts, increased quotas, and opened new plants. Steel output doubled, refinery capacity expanded. Railroads delivered raw materials with clockwork precision. The United States was not merely fighting a war, it was accelerating industrial expansion while doing so. For German high command, the message became painfully clear. Tactical victories were meaningless when every American casualty could be replaced, every destroyed tank rebuilt, every gallon of fuel replenished. The Wehrmacht's proudest armored formations, 2nd Panzer, Panzerlehr, 12th SS, were shadows of themselves by late 1944, not because they lacked bravery or skill, but because they lacked what the Americans had in limitless abundance. Engines that ran, shells that detonated, rubber for tires, grease for bearings, fuel for movement, and the endless industrial heartbeat that kept the U.S. Army advancing day after day. In the end, German commanders feared American logistics because it rendered their own operational art irrelevant. Blitzkrieg required fuel, ammunition, and mobility. By 1944, Germany had none. The United States had more than enough for itself and enough to supply its allies. This imbalance, this vast, unbridgeable ocean of industrial strength, became the true battlefield where the war was decided.
When historians described the breakout from Normandy, they often mention Patton's audacity, Bradley's planning, or the bombing that shattered German lines at Saint-Lô. But the Wehrmacht officers who survived the summer of 1944 pointed to something else entirely: the breathtaking speed with which the Americans sustained their advance. German commanders had always assumed that any army moving rapidly would eventually outrun its supplies. It was a universal truth of warfare. Armored spearheads burned fuel faster than trucks could deliver it. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Food and spare parts lagged behind. Sooner or later, even the most powerful force stalled. But in August 1944, the U.S. Army broke that truth. The reason was a logistical miracle that would become legendary: the Red Ball Express. From August 25 to November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express operated around the clock, moving along dedicated one-way supply routes closed to all other traffic. The system was simple in concept, but astonishing in execution. More than 6,000 GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, Dodge 3/4-ton trucks, and tractor-trailers formed convoys that never stopped moving, delivering fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts from the Normandy beaches to the rapidly advancing First and Third Armies. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate while driving, and rotated in shifts so the convoys never paused. They hauled over 412,000 tons of supplies in just 81 days. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. Their own logistics relied heavily on horses, Over 600,000 horses served on the eastern and western fronts combined, and their Trek fleet was a patchwork of captured vehicles, outdated designs, and fuel-hungry engines. When German formations moved, they drained their limited reserves instantly. When American formations moved, they were refueled every single day with industrial precision. Patton's Third Army became the embodiment of American logistical power. In September alone, his forces advanced nearly 400 kilometers across France, an operational feat unmatched by the Wehrmacht since 1940. And when Patton temporarily halted near the Moselle, it was not because the Red Ball Express had failed him. It was because the American advance had been so rapid that the European Theater Command had not anticipated needing even more trucks. Within days, the logistical system was expanded again. German commanders watching this unfold were stunned. They had built their military doctrine on the belief that strategic mobility came from concentrated strength and initiative. But here was an opponent who made mobility possible through the raw force of industrial supply. A colonel from the 2nd Panzer Division remarked after the war, "We believed their tanks were fast. Then we realized it was their gasoline that made them faster." The Red Ball Express did more than refuel tanks. It reshaped the battlefield. When ammunition ran low in a fierce fight, tens of thousands of artillery shells arrived within hours. When infantry divisions reported shortages of boots or rations, trucks delivered replacements the same day. When Sherman tanks lost engines or tracks, maintenance crews had access to endless crates of spare parts. German units, by contrast, cannibalized their own vehicles or abandoned them entirely. This abundance allowed American commanders to fight the kind of war Germany could not. At Brest, Metz, Aachen, and along the Siegfried Line, the Americans brought forward mountains of explosives, artillery shells, bridging equipment, and engineering tools. They fought siege battles with a level of preparation that Wehrmacht defenders had never seen. Even when supply dumps were moved hundreds of miles forward, American rail engineers repaired tracks and rebuilt bridges at record speed, allowing cargo to leapfrog from ports to front lines. Throughout this period, German intelligence reports reflected a growing sense of despair. Commanders noted that American armored thrusts did not slow as expected, and that their infantry never lacked food or ammunition. One report from Army Group B complained that American artillery was firing as if supply is infinite, and in a sense, it nearly was. With ships unloading continuously at Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Antwerp, the Americans had access to a logistical flow the Germans simply could not break. By late 1944, Allied port operations in France were unloading more tonnage per day than the entire German rail system could transport across the Western Front. The most bitter irony for the Wehrmacht was that their own logistic doctrine could not adapt. German divisional supply units required rail transport, but the Allies had destroyed bridges and rail yards across France. Their armies were forced to rely on dwindling fuel stocks and worn-out trucks, while the Americans poured gasoline onto the battlefield like water. The sight of endless American convoys demoralized more German soldiers than any single weapon. A captured officer admitted, "We thought we were fighting an army. We discovered we were fighting a factory." As the Red Ball Express roared eastward, it became clear that the U.S. Army did not merely outrun the Germans, it drowned them beneath a tide of supply. The Americans could keep fighting, keep advancing, keep replacing losses indefinitely. Germany could not. The breakout from Normandy was not simply a tactical victory. It was the visible proof that logistics, massive, relentless industrial logistics, was the weapon the Wehrmacht feared most.
When Hitler planned the Ardennes offensive, what would become the Battle of the Bulge, he wrapped it in secrecy, desperation, and the last flickers of delusion. He believed that one decisive strike could split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiation. But the men responsible for logistics inside the Wehrmacht saw the flaw long before the first Panther rolled into the forest. Germany did not have the fuel to carry the plan past its first days. The entire attack hinged on capturing American fuel dumps. If those dumps were destroyed, captured too late, or defended too well, the offensive would die in place. Meanwhile, the Americans, though caught by surprise, possessed such massive fuel reserves and such a flexible supply system that they could recover from the initial shock faster than the Germans could exploit it. The Ardennes became the clearest demonstration of the logistical imbalance that had haunted Germany since 1942. On paper, Germany assembled powerful forces: the 6th SS Panzer Army with Tiger II heavy tanks, the 5th Panzer Army, and several Volksgrenade divisions newly reconstituted for the attack. But behind their strength lay a fatal weakness. The offensive launched with only enough fuel for 3 to 4 days of combat, and that fuel was rationed with a precision bordering on desperation. Many units entered the battle with their tanks half full, trusting that American fuel would be captured intact. Panzer Lehr Division received so little fuel that several battalions could not participate in the opening assault. The Americans, by contrast, maintained staggering reserves. Even during the supply strain of late 1944, the Allied armies in Western Europe were receiving over 1 million gallons of fuel per day through pipelines, truck convoys, and rail shipments. Germany could not match a single day of Allied fuel flow, even with a month of production. When the offensive began on December 16th, the first German gains came quickly. Fog grounded Allied aircraft, American outposts were overrun, and Volksgrenade Division's units flooded into abandoned forest positions. Yet even in these early hours, signs of disaster appeared. Kampfgruppe Piper, spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel at Hansfeld, an extraordinary prize. But the fact that such a quantity could be called extraordinary revealed how starved Germany was. For the Americans, 50,000 gallons was a routine daily delivery to a single regiment. For Piper, it was a lifeline that extended his attack by mere hours. And the German advance quickly slowed. Terrain clogged with snow, narrow roads blocked by destroyed vehicles, and stubborn American pockets forced tanks to idle, burning precious fuel they could never replace. While Piper struggled to find gasoline, U.S. units in the rear were offloading tanker trucks, connecting refueling points, and rerouting logistics with astonishing speed. The Americans' ability to adapt their supply system was perhaps their greatest advantage. When one route closed, another opened. When one depot was threatened, others compensated. By December 20, the German fuel crisis turned from a problem into catastrophe. Piper's force, once the sharpest spear point of the offensive, stalled entirely. Panthers sat motionless in the snow, crews shivering inside tanks that could not move because every remaining drop of gasoline was needed for withdrawal. Eventually, they abandoned their Panther tanks, some of the most advanced armored vehicles in the world, because the Americans had denied them the one resource more valuable than armor: fuel. Across the Ardennes, the same pattern repeated itself. German attacks faltered not because the Americans had more tanks, nor because they had more artillery, but because the Americans could sustain combat indefinitely. Germany could not. Panzer Lehr's offensive burned out. Sturmhauptführer Gustav Knittel's reconnaissance battalion ran dry. Even elite SS units reduced their operations to foot patrols because their armored vehicles had to be parked to conserve the last liters of gasoline. Meanwhile, the Americans, though caught by surprise, surged back into the fight with overwhelming mobility. Once the skies cleared on December 23rd, supply planes dropped food, ammunition, and medical supplies into Bastogne. Fuel convoys, escorted by MPs, threaded through narrow roads to reinforce the 101st Airborne. Artillery units fired tens of thousands of shells because their supply lines never broke. When Patton's Third Army pivoted north in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, his tanks moved with ferocious speed because the Red Ball Express and new logistical corridors poured gasoline into their columns without interruption. To German soldiers freezing in the forests, it was demoralizing to watch American trucks continue rolling in endless columns while their tanks sat dead in the snow. A German officer from the 2nd Panzer Division later admitted, "We did not lose the Ardennes to their armies. We lost it to their fuel."
The Ardennes offensive was supposed to restore strategic initiative to the Reich. Instead, it exposed a truth German commanders had feared since 1943. Germany no longer possessed the logistical capacity to wage mechanized war. The Wehrmacht could still fight bravely and skillfully. Its soldiers were experienced, its armored vehicles deadly, its doctrine refined. But without fuel, ammunition, and supply reserves, none of that could matter. America had all three, in quantities that defied imagination. The Battle of the Bulge did not just fail. It revealed beyond doubt that logistics, not tactics, not technology, not even courage, had become the decisive factor in the war. Germany could not support its victories. America could not run out of the means to create them. And in that imbalance, the fate of the Western Front was sealed long before the first shot of the offensive was fired.
In the final months of the war, as the Wehrmacht staggered back toward the Rhine and American armies advanced with frightening inevitability, German commanders were forced to confront a truth they had spent years refusing to accept. The war had not been decided by brilliant maneuvers or heroic last stands, nor by which nation built the better tank or fielded the more elite infantry. It had been decided by something cold, relentless, and brutally mathematical: America's ability to move, supply, and maintain a mechanized army on a scale Germany could never hope to match. Even if every German soldier had fought with the skill of an SS veteran, even if every Tiger tank had been flawless, even if Allied bombing had been less effective, the outcome would not have changed. The logistical gap was too vast, too structural, too deeply rooted in the economic foundations of both nations. And by 1945, German leaders, military and civilian alike, could no longer deny the obvious. Germany never had the resources to win a long war against the United States. The reasons were baked into the geography and economy of both nations. Germany had no major oil reserves. The United States sat on some of the largest petroleum fields in the world. Germany relied on synthetic fuel plants that turned coal into gasoline at enormous cost and vulnerability. The United States refined more oil in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. German industry depended on railroads that crisscrossed a continent under constant bombardment. American industry stretched across a safe, untouched homeland with rail lines, pipelines, and highways linking factories to ports with astonishing efficiency. Even Germany's most celebrated strengths, its engineering, its discipline, its tactical brilliance, were crippled by logistical weakness. The Panther tank may have been technically superior to the Sherman in many ways, but it required a complex transmission that broke under stress and fuel consumption that Germany could not support. The Tiger II was a masterpiece of heavy armor, but it guzzled gasoline at a rate that made large-scale operations impossible. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army embraced equipment designed for mass production, ease of repair, and rugged use. A Sherman could be built in days, delivered in weeks, repaired in hours. A Panther required precious materials Germany was running out of, and when it broke, it often stayed broken. German trucks wore out faster than they could be replaced. American trucks, millions of them, formed the arteries of an unstoppable logistical organism. German artillery rationed shells. American artillery consumed so many that barrels had to be swapped mid-battle, and yet a fresh stockpile always waited behind them. German infantry divisions frequently operated at half strength. American divisions received constant replacements. Even uniforms, boots, and winter gear reflected the disparity. German soldiers shivered through the winter of 1944 in threadbare coats. American soldiers wore layers of insulated clothing fresh from the factories of New England. But the most profound difference was organizational. The U.S. Army understood logistics not as a supporting function, but as the foundation of warfare. American commanders such as Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley built operations around supply lines, pipelines, and truck corridors with scientific precision.
Their staff officers coordinated fuel flow, ammunition stocks, and repair schedules with scientific precision. The American G4 system tracked every ton of supply across Europe, adjusting deliveries dynamically as battle shifted. Germany had no equivalent. Its logistics remained divided between branches, its staff overstretched, and its fuel allocation dictated by politics rather than strategy. Hitler often diverted fuel to his favorite formations regardless of operational need. Trucks were distributed unevenly, rail capacity collapsed under bombing, and replacement units arrived at the front without proper equipment. Germany did not just lose the logistical war, it never understood how to fight it. This reality became painfully clear in the last major battles. In the Ruhr Pocket, entire German armies surrendered with stockpiles of rifles but almost no ammunition. In the final fighting around the Rhine, German tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could not be refueled. When American forces crossed the Remagen Bridge and expanded their bridgehead, German counterattacks faltered not from lack of courage, but from lack of supply. And when the Battle of the Bulge ended, captured German diaries revealed a common refrain: the Americans have endless gasoline, we have none. After the war, German generals writing their memoirs acknowledged the truth openly. General Alfred Jodl declared, "We were defeated by the enemy's material superiority long before we were defeated in the field." Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg, admitted privately that by 1943, the Panzerwaffe had no future because Germany lacked the resources for a mechanized war. Even Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, later wrote that no amount of industrial efficiency could compensate for the United States' overwhelming economic strength. In the end, the German High Command reached a stark conclusion. American logistics was not simply better, it was unassailable. It enabled the United States to project power across an ocean, sustain millions of men in continuous offensive operations, and replace every loss dozens of times over. It allowed Allied armies to dictate the pace of war while forcing Germany into a cycle of crisis, shortage, and collapse. And it ensured that once the United States entered the conflict, the clock began ticking inexorably toward German defeat. This is the legacy of the Western Front, a war decided not only by bravery or strategy, but by the silent, tireless machinery behind the lines, the pipelines, trucks, refineries, railroads, depots, and factories that fed the American war machine. The Wehrmacht feared this machinery because they knew the truth. No army, no matter how bold or battle-hardened, could withstand an opponent that never ran out of the means to fight. And so, when the war ended, one final lesson echoed across the ruined cities of Germany. The United States did not merely outfight the Reich, it outsupplied it. In modern war, logistics is destiny, and in 1944 to 45, American logistics wrote the ending long before the guns fell silent.